Welcome to the Testing Mission Driven Ideas webinar. I am David J. Bland. Basically, today, what we're going to be covering is kind of a customization of the business model canvas that I use for nonprofit and mission driven companies. So I thought this would be fun to kind of unpack. I don't write a lot about this type of work that I do, and I thought it'd be fun to kind of do a webinar and share what I'm up to behind the scenes. So if you have questions as we go, put them in chat or put them in the Q&A, and we will do our best to get to those. We almost always run over on our webinars answering questions, so I will try to honor our time as best as possible. We have Clarissa here today to help behind the scenes. So if you have any kind of technical questions or anything that you'd like to ask, and she can help you get that sorted out while I share some knowledge with you all. So let's go ahead and jump in. So yeah, I'm David. I'm out here in Northern California. Kind of what I end up doing is I end up blending design thinking and lean startup and business model innovation. It's really kind of the basis of my background. You know, my background kind of weaves through startup world and then going into corporates, and then I volunteer for nonprofits. And it's, you know, taking everything I've learned along the way, so learn from my mistakes, you know, and kind of blending it together into something that's like a process that people can use. And I'm very passionate about the process. You know, I've seen it work so many times. And so I truly believe it's like the future of entrepreneurship. A lot of this build it and they will come approach looks great when they come, but quite often we build it and they don't come. So I'm much more around the testing your way through things sort of approach. So you'll know that if you see any of my other videos or if you end up hanging out with me, kind of my style. So basically, you know, this webinar is going to show you kind of behind the scenes of how I approach, how I run workshops for mission-driven companies, and give you a little taste of kind of how to think about it and how to structure it. And then if you have any more questions or a deep dive, you can always, you know, reach out after today as well. So some of this, you know, not surprisingly, is going to be coming from testing business ideas. Now, I did not structure the book to specifically go after mission-driven nonprofit. However, a lot of the experiments, a lot of the framework still applies. I just make some customization. So, you know, this book is part of kind of a series from Strategizer, right? So this is the third book out of the series after business model generation and value prop design. And so in just all my work, I realize I'm not always working for-profit companies. You know, sometimes, you know, if I'm either volunteering for Code for America or Singularity University or working with the IMF or companies like change.org, like I work with a lot of things that aren't just for profit. And so what I was always trying to find is like, hey, how would I go through the for-profit, you know, framework, but how would I customize that for nonprofits? And luckily enough, there's a lot of stuff already out there that you can tap into. I just don't know if everyone's kind of stitched it together before in a way that kind of makes sense and that you can apply. But a lot of this stuff, again, if you have testing business ideas, it's going to help you, even though it's more for-profit flavor. It does have some of the elements of the framework that I'm going to be sharing with you today. Also, my co-author, Alex, who I love pairing with, you know, if we go back to the first book of this series in business model generation, that kind of kicked off the whole genre of like landscape style, full color business books. Well, I have to say, are really challenging to write, by the way, if you're trying to write one. Definitely, if you need help, let me know and send me a note. But they're very difficult to kind of craft, and having written one with him. But basically, I still come back to this book over and over and over again. And what I realized was, you know, through partnerships for other people, like the tools that he pretty much led with in that book, which is the business model canvas, which I still use today for a lot of my for-profit work, has been customized for mission-driven kind of nonprofit social good type stuff as well. And so I still love this canvas. I love it just because, you know, there's kind of a flow to it. So I usually kind of start over here with segments, and then I go to value prop, and then I go to channels, and then relationships, and then revenue streams. And then I'm usually going backstage to activities and resources and cost. and then who are your partners. So this is a flow I mostly use. There are situations where I customize it, like I might start from key resources and push into value prop or things, but this is the flow I use 9 times out of 10. And what I found is, if you try to kind of wedge this tool into for a for-profit tool into nonprofit entities, it starts to become challenging, right? You start saying, well, I'm not so much thinking about my customer segments. Also, the relationships maybe don't really fit. Channels, like it's more about kind of deployment. And then revenue streams, I'm not trying to measure for profit. I'm trying to measure more like the impact. And then the cost, it's more about kind of my mission cost or budget. And so luckily, Steve Blank, if you're working on mission driven ideas, Steve Blank and Alex have kind of collaborated to create a customization of this. Now, this is quite, it's not quite old. I mean, I first found it in 2016, I think, is when I first stumbled upon it. So it's been around for a while, but I feel like a lot of companies still don't know this exists. And while I didn't create it, my co-author Alex and working with Steve, they ended up kind of making this customization. The backstory is, Steve kind of created this out of hacking for defense, and then it's kind of been used in government. A lot of the government agencies I go into are using something like this, and so the premise is still there. With we need a one-page strategy document to show the relationships between things. And so there are a lot of different customizations of the business model canvas, but I always try to come back to kind of like the source of truth as much as I can, right? So it's why I work with Alex on a lot of the business model stuff. And it's also why I look for, well, what's Alex and Steve's take on mission-driven companies? What is a variation of this tool before you just start adding and drawing lots of boxes, which many people do? Like, what are the slight tweaks that you can make to make it work? Because I still need a one-page strategy document. I still need to visualize the strategy of the nonprofits and mission-driven companies I'm working with. And so when you think about it, this is where the customizations come in, right? Beneficiaries, instead of customer segments, we're talking about the beneficiaries. Who's benefiting our mission? Like, when we deliver value, who are the beneficiaries thereof? It's not so much about channels, but more about your deployment. Do you have a deployment process to deploy your value prop to your beneficiaries? It's often about buy-in and support. You have to get buy-in from all these different entities. And I'll go through an example with you all today. But basically, you have to get buy-in and support to be able to deploy, right, to your beneficiaries. Instead of having for-profit revenue streams, and usually for for-profit companies, I have a portfolio, right, of stickies there, and we're testing out different revenue streams. For the mission-driven stuff, we're talking about like, well, how do we achieve our mission? What are the impact factors? How do we know we're having the impact, the outcomes that we are striving for, and how would we measure those? And I think sometimes that's really hard. I'll give you an example today, but I feel like people are used to just loading this up with revenue streams when it's for profit. But when you think about impact, right, it's like, what's the impact we're going to have? How do we know we're achieving this mission? You need to be able to think that through and how you might measure that. The other customization that I want to call out is kind of mission, budget, and cost. And so I'll talk about viability a bit today. With nonprofits and mission-driven things, I talk about viability in a slightly different lens, but it's still super important to think through, okay, so if we do get a grant or we get funding, what is our budget for this? And can we achieve the impact that we're trying to strive for with the budget we have? And so depending on the workings of how you set up, whatever you're working on mission model for a mission, if you're working on nonprofit or some kind of other entity, basically you have to think through still, with what we have, can we have the impact that we're trying to achieve? And so I love this for an alignment tool to get people thinking through, okay, for our team, right? So often it's not just you, but even if it's just you, it's still good to get your thoughts out of your head. What are the things that we're like, who are the beneficiaries we're trying to impact here? What's our value prop to them? How do we deploy our value to them? How do we get buy-in support so that we can actually do this? What are the mission kind of achievement impact factors? What would we measure to be able to deliver this? And then on the backside, what's the cost? Now you notice some of the other things like value props, resources, activities, and partners haven't changed in this customization, right? Your value prop is still not necessarily your product, but the value or the service, the value that you're providing as a result of it. Your activities are still verbs, These are still verbs. They're the things that you have to do to make this work. Now, I'm not looking for everything you have to do. I'm looking for the key ones, right? If you had to pitch this to, let's say, a city council or somebody to get funding, you want to talk about the key things, not the hundreds of things, but the key ones. Same thing with your resources, like what are the nouns, right? What are the physical, digital resources that you would need for this to work? And then partners are still a big part of this, maybe even more so than my for-profit companies, because partners are going to help you with your activities and your resources, or potentially even be a part of your deployment to get to your beneficiaries. So it's a slight tweak on the for-profit tool, the business model canvas, but I find it's still just as effective, because when I run workshops and I'm working with, let's say, like big, nonprofit entities, this is the tool I swap in instead of the business model canvas when I'm going through the testing process. And I'll walk you through what that process kind of looks like. But if you look at them side by side, like I said, they're very, very similar, except again, the key differences: beneficiaries, buy-in and support, deployment, mission achievement, impact factors, and the budget cost. Those are the key differences between a for-profit, which is more about a business model, versus a mission-driven company, which is more about measuring impact. Okay. Now, I have to say, sometimes the lines get blurred. Sometimes I'm working with I think is a for impact kind of mission driven company, and they're also trying to generate revenue and be for profit. Or sometimes you have both of those existing in one company, right? So some of these big tech companies, they have nonprofit, like philanthropy kind of stuff that they're working on. And so you do have to kind of step back and say, okay, what's the right tool for the job here? Am I trying to do something for profit, or am I trying to really just do like something impact driven and it's more mission driven? And so you do have to kind of be aware of this context and situation you're in, and then kind of choose the right tool for the job. So let's talk through an example, because I know that's how you all learn, through examples, by doing. So if you're going to watch this webinar and go back and watch it, we're going to upload this to YouTube so you can go back and watch it again. And if you want to go back and through it and say, okay, I kind of want to sketch this out, I want you to have an example to go off of. And I say a lot of the examples out there, what I found anyway, just through when I first found this tool, there were a lot of defense related examples. And there's nothing wrong with, defense related examples, but I don't use this tool just for defense driven stuff. I use this again for a lot of impact stuff, social good, a lot of mission driven things. So I don't want you to be kind of like, oh, I Googled mission model canvas and all I saw were a bunch of defense things. Like it is used in many different contexts. And so I just want to kind of throw this out here to show you an example. So if you want defense stuff, just go Google it. I mean, I know Steve Blank has a ton of those on his blog as well, but I wanted to give you kind of another flavor of how, like, companies I work with and organizations I work with, how they use this. So I'm going to start with something pretty non-controversial, which is just community gardens. Or at least I don't think they're controversial. Basically, how do we spin up community gardens in underestimated communities? So people that maybe live in a food desert, or it's really hard to get access to fresh produce. Maybe they can't even afford groceries anymore because the inflation here in the United States and groceries are so expensive. How do we start kind of community build and also get people involved in basically enhancing their food security? Okay. So here's a little, now I customized this. This is not really the name of the company, although you'd be surprised how hard it is to spin up a company for these webinars. But I created a little company for you all today, which is called Allotment. And basically the mission here is like helping underestimated communities start, neighborhoods start community gardens. Okay. So this is kind of, what their overarching statement is. But let's walk through what a mission model canvas could look like for something like a community garden organization that's trying to connect landowners and communities. So first off, the flow I use is very similar to that flow that I mentioned early on, right? I often start over here with beneficiaries first, because I like starting about who we will serve. Is this a real problem in the world? Quite often when I'm working with nonprofits, it's not like they have an idea and they're searching for a community or a beneficiary or a group of people to target for that idea. It's usually the reverse. It's usually we have this really like wicked problem in the world, and we're trying to solve that, and we're kind of like, we're willing to pivot on potential solutions and value propositions to solve it for that group. All right. So I noticed some of my for-profit companies, right? It might be the inverse. It might be we have new tech and we want to leverage that new tech, and we have to kind of seek customer segment to address, a market to address for that new tech and kind of create and do a technology push. I don't see that as much in my mission driven work. It's much more like, oh, access to clean water or food security, and things like that. So it's usually a problem that's observable and that we're focusing on that group first. And we're trying to figure out how do we solve for that. Okay. So for your beneficiaries for something like allotment, which is for underestimated communities, that's who your beneficiaries would be, right? They're the underestimated communities that don't have access to food or for fresh produce quite often. And you'll notice here in the US, even it's like even the FDA and people are saying like, look, even doctors at this point are like literally writing prescriptions for fresh produce. That's the state of where we are in this country. I don't know. I know we have folks all around the world in this webinar, but just letting you know kind of what's going on here. Access to fresh produce and food insecurity is becoming a bigger deal here in the United States. So, what would our value propositions be? Now, again, your value prop isn't necessarily like your product or your service, it's the benefit thereof, right? It's the benefit these beneficiaries get from what you do, all right? So, we want to promote a healthy lifestyle, basically. Like, basically, you want to help underestimated communities become healthier, right? A healthier lifestyle with these community gardens. The next is really important. It's access to affordable food. All right. So when I say food desert, when you look at kind of these underestimated communities, they really don't have access to fresh produce sometimes, or affordable produce, or affordable food. And so what happens is we call it a quote unquote like food desert, where it's like this urban environment, but you don't actually have, let's say an organic grocery store or something you could go to. You might have to go really, really far away, and then the access becomes an issue, right? That we don't have transportation to get there, and it's very expensive, right? So this idea of like repurposing what we have to provide that access, okay? The third one, which I really think is a really key one here too, so you can have multiple value props, is building relationships within the community, okay? So it's not just promoting a healthy lifestyle here and giving access to food, but it's also building that community, like building the network between people, building that community. Community building is really hard. It's quite often takes, years and years to do well. But basically this idea of like, we're going to build relationships while we also provide these other things. So in your like mission model canvas, when you're working through your value props, it can be deceptively hard to come up with these, I've found. Quite often, people will go really high level and fuzzy, and it's so vague that people don't understand what it is. Or they'll put so many different things about the product in here, and people are like, I don't understand how that like benefits me. So just be aware that that middle box is kind of tricky. So you will have to work with you and your team to figure out, hey, what are like the major value props? What are the major benefits that we're providing to these folks? And so that is something that does take a bit of time and effort. One little trick that I use that I do write about in the book is if I'm interviewing people, like let's say we went to underestimated communities and we were talking to folks, I would try my best to use voice of the customer to help inform my value proposition. Okay. So I would take really good notes and I would come back and use those notes to help fill in, okay, we framed it this way, but honestly, the words they're using are slightly different. Maybe we should just use their words. Okay. Because sometimes what I see from nonprofit land is like you're communicating what you're trying to do, but people don't understand it. And so voice of the customer is super important here. And I think little things like taking the interview notes and going through them and then including them to shape your value prop a bit more. They might not be the words that you would use personally, but then when you think about, okay, but it's not about me here, it's about the beneficiaries and them understanding it. So just be mindful of there's some little tricks you can use there as far as shaping your value proposition into something people can understand. Deployment. So for here, like this company has their little process, like their little playbook they run for deploying this. I won't get into all the details of it today, but usually nonprofits have some kind of playbook. Literally, if you wanted to start a community garden today, you could go online and see people's playbooks for starting those and all the different things you need to do. So it's not something you have to like recreate the wheel on. Now, for buy-in and support here, there are two major groups. First is like a city council. So if you're doing something in an urban environment, you do need to get approval. There's zoning laws or all these things. You need to get the buy-in and support of city council. And you have to get who might be different than the landowners. So you do need land, let's say, for doing a community garden. And so you will need buy-in and support from a landowner to kind of set it out. So I do I don't put those in beneficiaries because we're trying to benefit the underestimated communities. It doesn't mean there can't be overlap there, but usually buy-in support, you're trying to think like, what would kill this? Like, if we don't get buy-in from this group, could they shut this whole thing down? And especially if you're doing something like this, where there has to be zoning laws or there has to be some kind of lease or anything. Well, we'll get into that detail a bit too. But are there things that would like potentially could kill it, right? For-profit land, you're usually talking about, your user customers, your influencers, your recommenders, your economic buyers, your decision makers. Usually out of that list, it's usually like the decision maker or economic buyer that could kill the whole thing. It's kind of similar to that, but for buy-in and support, you're thinking through, okay, who would I have to get buy-in and support for? Okay, so let's move into mission achievement and impact factors, because this is usually the hardest thing I find that teams struggle with in filling this out. So for this, we'd have to say, okay, so how do we know we're having an impact with these gardens? Well, one would just be measuring like crop yield, right? So are we actually producing vegetables that, that actually grow, right? And you don't have to recreate the wheel in that either. There are all kinds of different research groups you could go to, and you can go online and find, how would I measure the output or the outcome, the yield of a garden? The next thing we would measure is something like the number of diverse species. So we're not trying to grow just one type of food here. We're trying to measure, different types of species of food, because we want this thing to be, kind of year round if possible. And then I was thinking through like this idea of access to affordable food, right? And trying to help the food desert issue and access, right? You'd want to measure something like the dollar amount in saved in groceries and buying food. You could also even split this down into per family, budget per family. It really, you could go down to a level that whatever makes sense for you, but you want to be able to measure, is this an impact, right? Is the impact we having, are we actually producing the food? Do we have a diverse amount of food? And then we also saving money for people, right? Now on the backstage, you have your kind of key activities. Again, I'm doing high level here. I'm not going to do the hundreds of activities, but the verbs, remember the verbs you're walking through here, connecting landowners and communities. And then also the planning and maintaining of the gardens are going to be things you have to continue to do. So these are going to be like key activities that are going to be important. And then resources, there could be quite a few. And I try to just highlight the main ones here, which are things like, well, we need land. Like it's a pretty important one. We're going to actually need a community, right? That we're going to either try to nurture or help create. We're going to need tools, like literally tools for the gardening. We're going to need some element of landscaping and water. This could be a really broad one, but I just wanted to kind of simplify it here for you all today. But there's some element of like infrastructure, right, to make that work. You're going to need the actual plants. And then you might need something like insurance, right? So let's say we're going to city council and then it's zoned a specific way. And then for us to get the lease, we have to have, a specific kind of insurance or something like that. So resources are kind of like, here are the things that we need, right? The nouns. And then you can look at activities and resources and start saying, okay, for mission budget and cost, what are the things that we're going to need to make and pull this off? And so things like, well, the lease is going to cost. Like they might rent us this land for $1 a year, or it might be a lot more than that, right? So could be a fixed versus, variable cost. Element of infrastructure here, the infrastructure of like putting this thing together, and it's going to cost, to get this up and running. The maintenance, you're going to have to, like the weeding and all this stuff, you're going to have to keep doing over and over. The water, like there's an element of maintenance here that's going to be a variable cost for this to keep going. And then, depending on if insurance is a requirement, insurance is also a cost you have to consider. So this is where I'm not going to hit you with a bunch of numbers today, but for you working on mission driven stuff, you can kind of back of the napkin say, okay, based on these activities and resources, what are the numbers here for like, how much are we going to pay for this lease? How much is it going to cost to get this thing up and running? How much is it going to cost to maintain it? How much is our insurance going to cost, right? And so you can start like narrowing in on some numbers there to help say that we need like this amount to achieve this impact that we're trying to do for the community, which is feed people with diverse amount of food and then helping them save in groceries. So you can quantify some of this stuff. It just might take a bit of, again, back in the napkin math, and then trying to figure out, okay, can we even achieve this impact for the cost? And I think even something like a community garden, right? They're always more expensive than you would think, right? So you might end up spending somewhere like between 5 to like 20K on getting this thing going. And I think people feel like, oh no, we got land, and then we just throw some plants in, and it happens. Like there, when you start thinking through your strategy, there's all these different costs that can add up. Next, partners. Okay, so here with partnerships, there's some really obvious ones. One, just partnering with something like nursery and supply stores, right? So we're going to partner with people that can provide the plants potentially, potentially even can provide the tools. It makes sense to partner with schools. It could be elementary, undergrad. It could be universities, kind of depending on the neighborhood and what the needs are. You might even partner with someone like master gardeners, like showing you how to set everything up. There are a lot of different programs here in the US where they'll donate their time to kind of show you how to set up and get things planted in a specific way. And then, surprisingly, you might even partner with healthcare providers. So, healthcare providers, again, they are trying to promote preventative care. They're trying to promote healthy living. Like I said in the earlier part of this webinar, sometimes they're writing prescriptions on literally fresh produce at this point. So there are surprisingly some healthcare providers where you can also partner with that might actually provide you some land or give you resources or budget or a grant to help do some of this stuff. And so when you start kind of modeling it out, right, a lot of this that you may have used in something like a business model canvas translates pretty well over, right? Things like partners, activities, resources, value prop. The only minor differences are and it's why I swapped this tool out, is because I'm not talking about customers generating revenue, right? I'm talking more about beneficiaries and can we have the impact that we need? I'm talking about how do we deploy this? I'm talking about can we get buy-in support from whoever we need to? And they could be different parts of a region to get buy-in and support to do this. I'm looking at for the cost, can we actually achieve? So it's similar, but it's different enough that it takes a bit of practice building these out. And so when I'm running workshops, right, if I'm doing a for-profit workshop, we literally like print out the canvas, business model canvas, throw it up on the wall, right? And we're like using stickies or statties, to fill it out. When I'm running mission-driven stuff, it's kind of the same flow, but I'm using the mission model canvas on the wall instead. And I'm walking through, who are your beneficiaries? What's your value prop to them? How do you deploy this? How do you get buy-in and support? What's your mission achievement impacts? And then the backstage, I'm going through, okay, so what do we need to do? What do we need to have? What's this going to cost? And who do we partner with? So the flow is very, very similar. It's just a slightly different context. And every time I've tried to, like early in my career where I tried to force the business model canvas into a nonprofit situation, it just got weird, because we're trying to fill out revenue streams, but they're not really revenue streams. We're trying to talk about customers, but they're not really customers, So learn from my mistakes. Don't try to force a tool that is not appropriate for the context that you're working in. All right. And I find like I didn't create this tool, right? Like Steve and Alex did. And I was like, oh, this is what I was looking for. So let me actually like dig in, right? So before I start customizing a lot of tools, I try to go back and see, has anyone else kind of ran into this problem I'm focused on? And then what can I kind of adopt or plug into? So in all this, that's great in theory land, right? You go through your canvas, you kind of write it all out. That's so great. But you have to write down what would need to be true, right? For this to work. Like what would have to be true? Same thing that I do with for-profit companies. I do the same thing with mission-driven nonprofit companies. It's like, this sounds great on paper, but how do we go test it? Now, surprisingly, I still use the desirable, viable, and feasible framing for nonprofits. The only thing that's a little different here is when we're talking about viability, right? It's more about like cost and impact. So instead of saying, things like, oh, here's how the different revenue streams and we're generating revenue, I'm talking a lot more about cost and impact with viability. And there's still a lot of should we questions like, is this sustainable and all this other stuff. And obviously we have a moral compass that we're trying to follow and all that. But this idea of cost and impact slightly changes a bit of the flavor of how I theme things. And I'll show you here in a minute how I theme them on the canvas. But other than that, I'm still going through, desirability. Do they want this? Is this a real need? Is there some kind of pain that people are experiencing? With feasibility, I'm still going through your resources and your activities and the partnerships. I'm also talking more about a little bit more regulatory things that might pop up there. But I would say overall, this kind of framing from design thinking and user-centered design still works for nonprofits. I haven't had to really customize it much at all. So when you look at something like the mission model canvas, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, so we kind of laid this out. How do we start looking at risk in our strategy with our mission? Okay. So desirability fits pretty well to the top right. It's not perfect, but this idea of your value prop and your beneficiaries and all that, like there's a lot of desirability risk. Can we actually, like, is this something we like the beneficiaries really need until they understand what we're trying to do? Can we actually get buy-in and support for it? Viability, I still use the bottom two boxes for viability because it's about your cost and your impact and your achievement, right? And so if you can't achieve this, you might have some risk around, wow, we actually just don't have a big enough budget to achieve what we're trying to achieve. How would we start to navigate that? What kind of assumptions are we making around that as well? And then backstage feasibility looks very similar to the business model canvas. I still use feasibility backstage to say, okay, activities, resources, partners, what would prevent this from being executed on, after we work through some of the other risk, if we can't do these activities or if we can't get these resources or the partners can't provide things to us, right? So really interestingly enough, I theme it very similar to how I approach the for-profit work. You still have, right? You still have risk around kind of the do they, do we have the right group of beneficiaries? Do they really have these pains we're trying to solve for? Viability is still about cost and impact, right? Now, in a for-profit, it's going to be more cost and revenue, but in a mission-driven thing, it's quite often about, okay, for this budget we have or these grants we have, can we have the impact that we're looking for? And then feasibility is still about like the ability to execute, right? The things about activities and resources and partners. And so when I start modeling this stuff out with people, it's great to use a different tool to get them like a context that they feel applies to them, right? I'm not shoving something for profit in front of their faces. I'm respecting where they are and I'm saying, look, here's a tool that I would use instead. But you know what? You still have assumptions you have to address if this is going to work. It's not as if we just write a 5-year plan and go execute on it. Like we don't know how much of this is real, right? And so if we looked at like the business model for allotment, you could start to see some of that play out here, right? You can see the top right of them for desirability risk. Underestimated communities. Do we really have a deep understanding of what they need? City council and landowners. Do we have a value prop that they actually understand and resonates with them as well? And then if you look at the bottom two boxes, a lot of viability risk and wow, there are a lot of costs here. And can we even measure the output? Like, do we have a way to measure that we can save people dollar amounts in groceries? Like if we back into that, right? And then the backstage is a lot about, okay, there's a lot of activities and resources and partners that need to align here for us to make this work. And so we have feasibility risk as well. And so when you start looking at it through that lens, yes, use the canvas, yes, help them model it all out, but don't stop there, be able to show them, hey, I think we have some desirability risks, some viability risk here, some feasibility risk. Let's write those down because those still could kill this thing if proven wrong. Okay, so how would we go test those? So basically, very similar. I still theme it because I want people to talk about risk in a very, very specific way. So after that, I pretty much just run it through the testing process. So for example, we get our mission model canvas down. We take our first like best guess at it. I usually don't go too much further out than 3 to 6 months. I know with some of this, it may seem like, oh, I want to project 5 to 10 years when we're super successful with this new thing we just thought about. I find that's not always helpful for your near-term experimentation. So I usually don't predict too far out. I'm trying to stay relatively near-term on what has to work for this to even get off the ground and start going. Then after we write them out, this looks very familiar, right? Assumptions mapping. I still use assumptions mapping if I'm working with mission-driven nonprofits. I find it's a very interesting, structured conversation for them to have about risk, right? What are the most important things we have no evidence about? Let's test that stuff out before we jump in and kind of get too ahead of ourselves. And then we match experiments to that type of risk. So, that is, you can still pull from the book there. Now in the book, and this is the same usually question I get for B2B kind of businesses that reach out to me, is I didn't necessarily specifically code every experiment, based on the type of business, right? I don't have a lot of codings in there for B2B versus B2G versus nonprofit versus like, it would have gotten really confusing and really out of hand. So instead, what we have is desirable, viable, feasible. And then we still have cost, setup time, runtime, evidence strength, capabilities, theme. So we still have all this stuff in there. And so what I find is that I'm matching the experiments that make the most sense for that mission driven org that I'm working with, given what their risk is at the time, right? So there isn't like a perfect sequence or anything, but I can kind of walk through one here to give you an idea of how that can work. So basically, let's go with allotment for now, right? So we're going through this community garden strategy. Well, first we might do something like search trend analysis, right? So we might go off and do some search trend analysis to see, where are people really searching for food in metropolitan areas in the U.S. We'd probably focus on like the Bay Area. We'd focus on Chicago area. We'd focus on New York area, like Atlanta area. So we would start looking at specific regions and what kind of analysis we can do for just, people searching for affordable food and things like that. We might do something after that, like a day in the life, right? Where we go and we observe a lot of ethnographic research. We don't just assume we know what's going on there. We boots on the ground, go find out what's going on and document all that. From there, we might start storyboarding out potential solutions, like how would we deploy a community garden here? What might that look like? And help have that, if we want to do custom interviews, it helps make it very visual if we have something like a storyboard. And then we might do something like a letter of intent. So we might go to city council or landowners and just try to, the people that always say they want to do something and then when it gets to putting in writing, they don't. We want to get sooner versus later, are people willing to put stuff in writing, So similar to how we do experiment sequences with other entities, right? You could say, oh, well, what I learned from search trend analysis would inform where I go for something like a day in the life. That would help inform what I do for like storyboarding and coming up with potential solutions that I might actually go off and run interviews with. And then that might help inform, where I'm going to go to try to get people who verbally said something to get them to put it in writing, even though it's a non-legally binding contract. So the overall flow here is pretty similar. Again, what I'm showing you is that for nonprofit mission-driven stuff, I'm swapping out the business model canvas for the mission model. I'm still theming it in a very similar way, right? Desirable, viable, feasible. And then we're mapping them out with assumptions, and then we're going into experiment design. So I think why I wanted to share this with you all is that it's not a completely wildly different process that I follow. It's just I swap out the tools based on for-profit or not for-profit. And then I might choose different experiments based on their context. But quite frankly, I'm choosing different experiments based on any team I'm working with. Even if they're in the same industry, quite often they're in a different spot, they have different risk. So I'm always doing this mental exercise of, okay, what have I seen in my like 15 years of doing this that might apply here? And can I help apply a process to people that really deeply know an area, right? Because I'm pretty much a process coach, right? I'm not trying to be a domain expert in your nonprofit, for example, or your mission-driven company. So a couple things before we jump into Q&A, and we're not out of time yet, so I'm actually doing better than I normally do. So if you'd like to learn more, and these are some links that Clarissa can drop in the chat for you, and you will have the recording, and I'll post these links on YouTube as well in the description for the recording. So first off, I do have an article on how to do this. It's probably one of my most popular articles I've ever written, which is surprising because I thought, oh, there's plenty of stuff on Mission Model Canvas, and people don't really need to know more. But as I learn, I like to write about like how I learn, and that helps me as well. And apparently it helps all of you too. So there is an article that I have that walks you through basically what I've just explained, how you kind of look at the canvas, what the differences are between the canvases, what those differences mean, how I theme them, and then kind of the flow. So if you're looking for a write-up version of what I just covered, there's a link here for you. Another thing is I do have a newly created assumptions mapping course. So if you're like, oh man, that assumption mapping part didn't make a lot of sense to me. Well, lucky for you, I actually created a course on how to go through it step by step. So you don't need me coaching you all the way through. I'm kind of like your virtual coach here and helping you through it. And then finally, I am doing another program with Alex and Strategizer this October. This is more kind of for-profit, but I just wanted to throw this in here. If you're trying to look for a deep dive in a 3-day experience, I also have that coming up as well. So I am sure we have questions because I threw a lot at you, as I normally do. And And so I'm curious what kind of questions popped up as we went through this, because I have not been paying attention to chat. I see a notice about an impact canvas. Yeah, this might be similar to impact canvas. I know there are different variations of this canvas um, for different orgs. So I've seen things around charity. I've seen things around impact. I just personally went back to the one that I use. I don't like maybe it's a personal thing, but I don't like sharing how-to tips on stuff I don't use. So mission model canvas is the one I use when I'm working with like I say, like Code for America or Singularity or IMF or someone like that. So this is something I wanted to throw out there is like, this is how I approach it. But if there's another canvas that kind of fits this, that works for you, then I'm not going to push back and say, don't use it. I would just say, be careful of the theming. Sometimes they're really tricky to theme, especially have a bunch of boxes. It's kind of hard to say, is that desirability or viability, feasibility? Because maybe there's like all over the place and it's like a big checkerboard. And the other thing is, still go test it, right? So even if you're using a different canvas, just make sure you're going in and testing it, and people don't take it as fact, and then they just try to create this giant plan they're going to go execute on for their mission-driven nonprofit thing. Just make sure that you're kind of plugging it into the testing process would be my advice there. But yeah, thanks for there's probably like a bunch of different canvases that do kind of like this. I just didn't want to share ones that I hadn't personally used. Clarissa, anything else in here that jumps out to you as question?
In the chat, in the question and answer, it said, could you explain the difference between buy-in and support and key partners?
Oh yeah. So with buy-in and support, they may not be a partnership. I can see where that might confuse you. Buy-in support is more like, where do we need to get the consensus to go forward? Like, what are the entities in our way that could stop us from doing this? Where I view key partners is more like back end of the model, and there's an element of shared risk that they might take on, right? So if they're providing tools, or they're providing a grant, or they're providing, let's say, the plants and all that, or the land, there's an element of kind of shared risk there, where they're bringing either a resource or an activity, or potentially helping you with your deployment, or helping bring costs down for the mission cost. I'm not saying there's never an example where you couldn't have overlap in buy-in and partners, but usually I try to separate them out as like this entity, like this example I walked through, right? Like city council isn't necessarily a partner in this case. They're just like, they're potentially like in the way of us doing this and going forward. So, but I can see that there might be some overlap there, but I usually view key partners as backstage, and there's an element of shared risk here. They're providing either an activity or a resource, or driving down costs, or potentially deployment for you to reach your beneficiaries. So it might be like trivial, but I wouldn't get too tripped up on it. But think of buy-in and deployment as like the people that could say no, that could prevent this from going forward, is usually how I frame it.
Another question is the mission model canvas not looking on revenues? So assuming you get a budget upfront instead of paying customers besides beneficiaries.
Yeah, the way I use it, it's not so much about revenues. Now, it does get messy sometimes with companies that do mission-driven plus for-profit work. But basically, the way I look at it is, it's for the cost you have. Can you achieve the impact? And so the impact is usually not revenue. It's usually like, are we solving the problem that we said we would solve? How would we measure that we're solving it? And so, like, if I'm working with a very different example, but I work with a company up in upstate New York that was working on for-profit company, but they were working on fighting like Hep C epidemics in the South, the southern part of the United States. They weren't trying to make a profit off of solving and helping address this like hepatitis C epidemic. They were literally just trying to say, well, it's a really long program, and can we measure people completing the program? Can we measure people like living over months, years with this, and being able to kind of address this and help them? Like, it wasn't a for-profit thing, right? So it doesn't make sense to kind of load it up with a bunch of, how much money can we make off this? It's more about, can we have the impact on the beneficiaries that we say that we want to achieve, and how would we measure it? So there's a lot of, it's both qualitative and quantitative. I usually kind of skew towards the quantitative, because you want to come back with kind of this report of saying, hey, for the grant money we had, or for the funding we received, here's the impact, the measurable impact that we were able to take. And so you almost want to have that to make the case for getting more funding if you need it. So yeah, I don't usually measure the for-profit stuff in the bottom right there. I'm usually measuring impact. If I'm doing for-profit stuff, I try to use something like the business model canvas. All right, time for one more.
Yep. And then it says, what is the best way to capture potential saboteurs or people we need buy-in from that might hurt the mission or might group more groups that might never give buy-in? Any advice on how to use the canvas or other tools to prepare for them?
Oh yeah, saboteurs. I really hate labeling people as saboteurs, but I know Steve has that laid out as far as like your user, customer, recommender, influencer, economic buyer, decision maker. He also has saboteurs in there. Um, I try to flip people, and maybe it's just my coaching style, but I try to take people that are really against something and kind of understand why they're against it, and then try to make them a champion of it. And so maybe it's just me. I don't know if there's a box in the canvas I would say is going to solve that for you, but my style is usually I try to find people that are detractors who are kind of in the way, and I try to start to really deeply understand why they're so against it. And then I try to help understand that. And so without making that effort, you're almost never going to be able to win them over. And I'm not saying everybody's intentions are great. You know, not everyone comes along for the ride here, but that really has helped me in my coaching is really starting to understand the why behind the blocking and then try to alleviate some of those fears. So it doesn't always work. It's not something like a box in the canvas is going to solve for you, but it's good to lay them out, right? When you go through and lay out your strategy, it's good to know what could kill it. And I have ran in situations where the decision maker was also actively undermining things. So I would just say my coaching style tip there would be try to understand the why, try to get to the root cause of why the blocking is there, and then try to alleviate some of that. But yeah, it's tough. I fully admit that it's tough. It's good to visualize it first because at least you're not blindsided by it if it happens. All right. So we stayed on time today. I'm very excited by that. I want to say thanks for everyone joining. Again, this is a little different kind of session than I usually run. I'm usually talking about testing for-profit stuff. And then I just realized, wow, I don't write much or share much about what I do and kind of impact-driven and nonprofit stuff, which, sometimes, I'm just volunteering my time to help folks out. And so if you want to reach out, if you have more information or more questions about this, we tried to get through them all today, but there's my contact info. You will get a recording of this. It'll be up on YouTube and you can check it out. And so hopefully it helps you not just learn the mission model canvas, because I say there is content out there on that, but really start to understand the theming of it and how it plugs into the testing. So if you came away with that today, then I'm calling this a win. So thank you everyone for your time. Again, you'll see the recording on this, and yeah, keep testing your ideas, even your mission driven ones. Thanks everyone.